The rain thickened, dripping from the eaves onto my shoulders. I heard children's laughter inside, recognized my grandson Matthew's voice. Deborah kept the door slightly ajar, as if she feared I might force my way in. "I'm soaked, honey. Can I at least come in for a bit?" She sighed, glancing back nervously. "Look, James's parents are here, and you know Vera. She organized everything, and it just wouldn't be convenient." Vera, James's mother, the woman who for years had seemed to compete with me for my grandkids' affection, always making a point to correct me in front of them, to suggest my methods were old-fashioned. "So, I'm inconvenient now?" My voice faltered. "That's not what I said, Mom. It's just... Look, can we talk another day? They're calling me." Before I could reply, the door clicked shut. I stood there, clutching my plate of mini cheesecakes under the rain that was now coming down harder. 42 years ago, I spent 36 hours in labor bringing Deborah into this world. I remembered sleepless nights when she had asthma, the birthday parties I organized even when money was scarce, after Augustus left us. My 70 years weighed like lead that night. The plate of mini cheesecakes, which I'd prepared with such care, started to get soggy around the edges. I always made a point to prepare that special recipe for Matthew, my sweet grandson who always declared my treats the best in the whole wide world. Now there I was, locked out of my own daughter's home. You must be wondering how a mother gets to this point. How a 70-year-old grandmother ends up alone in the rain, holding a plate of sweets, unable to hug her grandson on his birthday. It all started to shift about 3 years ago, when Vera, James's mother, moved closer. Before that, I had my place in the family. It wasn't perfect, of course. Deborah had always been the most temperamental of my daughters. Since she was little, she had that determined way about her, that stubbornness that reminded me so much of her father. Augustus left us when she was just 8. Melissa, the oldest, was 12. He just packed his bags one day and said he needed to find his way. His path never crossed ours again. I raised my girls alone. I worked as a secretary during the day and sewed school uniforms at night to make ends meet. My hands still bear the marks of the needles, of the nights I spent stitching. I never complained. It was what needed doing. Deborah married James 10 years ago. In the beginning, everything seemed fine. He's an accountant, a quiet man, one of those who doesn't say much at family gatherings. When Matthew was born 8 years ago, I was the first to arrive at the hospital. I remember holding that little bundle and feeling like my heart could burst with love. 3 years later came Sophia, with those curious little eyes that reminded me so much of Deborah at the same age. For the first few years, I'd go to their house every week. I'd bring food, help with the kids, tell them stories about their father, so they'd know where they came from, even with all of Augustus's flaws. The kids loved my sweets, especially the mini cheesecakes. It was our tradition. Then Vera retired and moved to an apartment 10 minutes from Deborah's house. At first, it was small things. She started showing up on the same days I visited. She'd bring expensive gifts for the kids, things my teacher's retirement wouldn't dream of covering. She'd comment on how the kids were getting a little chunky when I brought my sweets. "Olga, you know sugar isn't good for children," she'd say with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. Back in my day, we were stricter about those things. I'd smile and swallow hard. I didn't want to cause problems for Deborah. My visits started to become more spaced out. First it was every week, then every 2 weeks. Before I knew it, I was seeing my grandkids only once a month. There was always an excuse. The kids had swim lessons, tutoring, piano practice. Their schedule seemed to have no room for Grandma. Melissa, my older daughter, noticed the shift. "Mom, you need to stand your ground more," she'd say. But how do I stand my ground? Deborah always had that strong will, and I, after so many years fighting alone, learned to choose my battles. The last time I saw Matthew, a month before his birthday, he ran to me at the door and hugged me tight. "Grandma, did you bring mini cheesecakes?" "Of course, my love. I made them especially for you." Vera appeared behind him, with that look of disapproval. "Matthew, you just had a snack. You're not eating sweets now." The boy visibly deflated but didn't argue. I learned later that Vera had instituted a healthy diet for the children. My sweets, apparently, didn't fit into this new order. That day, I realized something was different. Deborah barely talked to me. James stayed cooped up in his office. The children were called away to do homework before I could really talk to them. I left feeling strange, as if I was visiting strangers, not my own family. When I heard about Matthew's birthday, I called to confirm the time. Deborah was vague, said they hadn't decided if they'd do anything. I insisted, asked if I could help with the preparations. "No need, Mom. Vera is organizing everything." That stung, but I swallowed hard. Vera organizing my grandson's birthday. The same woman who barely knew his favorite color, who didn't know he despised pineapple on pizza or that he slept with the hall light on because he was afraid of the dark. On his birthday, I got ready carefully. I put on my navy blue dress, the one I saved for special occasions. I applied a discreet lipstick, pulled my silver hair back into a simple bun. I prepared the mini cheesecakes in the morning, using the recipe my own mother taught me. I took 2 buses to get to Deborah's house, holding the plate carefully so the sweets wouldn't get squashed. It was drizzling when I arrived. I heard music and laughter coming from inside. My heart warmed. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was all just my imagination. I rang the doorbell, adjusting the plate of sweets in my hands. And then Deborah opened the door with that expression, half surprised, half annoyed. "Mom, you shouldn't be here. I didn't invite you." The rest you already know. I stood there in the rain, holding my plate of mini cheesecakes, listening to my grandson's laughter inside, kept out by my own daughter. I went back home by bus, the plate of sweets on my lap. On the way, a younger woman offered me her seat. "You're all soaked, dear," she said kindly. A stranger showed more consideration than my own daughter. My small apartment had never felt so empty as it did that night. It's a small place, just 2 bedrooms, in the neighborhood where I raised my girls. The walls are filled with photographs. Deborah and Melissa as little girls, their graduations, their weddings, my newborn grandkids. Each image tells a story of sacrifice and love. I placed the plate of mini cheesecakes on the kitchen table and sat down, still in my wet clothes. I didn't have the energy to change, to make tea, for anything. I just stared at the phone, waiting for Deborah to call, to realize what she'd done, to apologize. The phone didn't ring. In the following days, I waited for a call that never came. I tried calling Deborah, but she didn't answer. I texted asking if she was okay, and only got a, "We're busy, talk later." Melissa called me 2 days later. Her voice was strange, like she was walking on eggshells. "Mom, are you okay? I heard what happened at Matthew's birthday." "Who told you? Deborah?" "Yeah, she called me. Said you showed up uninvited." My heart tightened. Melissa, it was my grandson's birthday. What do you mean, uninvited? Since when do I need a formal invitation to see my own family? There was a silence on the other end of the line. Mom, you know how Deborah is. And it seems Vera had organized everything. Invited her friends. And I'm not welcome in my own daughter's house because her mother-in-law decided to throw a party? It's not like that, Mom. It's complicated. Complicated. Everything in life had always been complicated. It was complicated when Augustus left us. It was complicated raising 2 girls alone. It was complicated working 2 jobs and still being present in their lives. But I did it all without complaining, without asking for anything in return. Just out of love. A week after the incident, Melissa came to visit me. I noticed she was uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. Mom, Deborah told me what happened, she began, nervously stirring her cup of tea. I think you need to understand that. Well, the kids are growing up and maybe it's better to give them more space to form their own family. What more space could I give? I only see my grandkids once a month, if that. It's just... Vera mentioned that you always bring sweets even when she's asked you not to, because of the kids' diet. And you always tell the same old stories about their father, who's passed on. And that's a reason to leave me in the rain? To not even let me give my grandson a hug on his birthday? Melissa looked away. Mom, no one's saying you can't see the grandkids. It's just maybe less often and with some conditions. That word, conditions, hit me like a slap to the face. After everything I'd done, after raising my daughters alone, working 2 jobs, now I needed conditions to see my own family. What conditions are we talking about, Melissa? My voice came out firmer than I expected. She sighed as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. Well, not bringing sweets without asking first. Don't talk so much about Dad. You know Deborah still holds a grudge against him. Don't give unsolicited advice about the kids' upbringing. The list went on. Each item a small stab. It wasn't just about my mini cheesecakes or telling old family stories. It was about erasing me, diminishing me, turning me into an acceptable version of a grandmother who wouldn't bother anyone, who wouldn't remind Deborah of where she came from, who wouldn't compete with Vera's influence. I understand, I finally said when Melissa finished her list. And you agree with all of this? She hesitated. Melissa had always been the peacemaker, ever since she was little. When Deborah and I fought, it was always Melissa who'd come with a crayon drawing, a dandelion picked from the yard, anything to restore peace. I just want everyone to get along, Mom. You know how stubborn Deborah can be. Yes, I knew. Stubborn like her father. Stubborn like me, perhaps, though in different ways. My stubbornness was in persisting, in waking up every day and continuing the fight. Hers was in cutting ties, in pushing away whatever bothered her. After Melissa left, I stood there, looking at the old photos on the wall. Deborah on my lap, Melissa holding my hand on her first day of school. I remembered washing clothes by hand to save on the electric bill, packing my own lunch for work so I could afford school supplies for them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Melissa's words echoed in my head. Conditions. As if I were an unwelcome guest, not the woman who'd given her life for that family. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. 70 years of life had taught me many things, but perhaps the most important was that dignity has no price. Not even the love for my grandchildren justified being treated like an inconvenience, like someone who needed conditions to exist. I got ready carefully, put on my navy blue dress suit I saved for special occasions, and hailed a cab to Deborah's house. It was Saturday. I knew they'd all be home. On the way, I mentally rehearsed what I'd say. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to create more distance. But I needed to establish my worth, my dignity. I needed my daughter to understand that love isn't submission. The cab pulled up in front of Deborah's house. I paid the fare and stood for a few moments, looking at the 2-story house, its well-kept garden, Matthew's bike propped against the porch. How many memories that place held. How many Sunday pot roasts. How many stories told. How many hugs exchanged. I took a deep breath and walked to the door. I rang the doorbell, feeling my heart pound. What happened next would forever change my relationship with my daughter and my grandchildren. But some things need to be said, even when they hurt. When Deborah opened the door, her surprised expression quickly turned to irritation. "Mom, I told you we're busy." "I didn't come to stay, Deborah. I came to say something important." She hesitated, but let me in. In the living room, James and Vera were sitting on the sofa. The grandchildren were playing in the backyard, visible through the sliding glass door. "Olga," Vera began with that falsely sweet tone. What a surprise. I looked at that woman who somehow had become the gatekeeper of my own family. She wore an expensive outfit, discreet but visibly costly jewelry. Everything about her exuded a confidence that came from privilege, something I'd never known. "I'll be brief," I said, keeping my spine straight as my own mother taught me. "For 70 years I was a daughter, for 45 I was a mother, for 15 I was a grandmother. I dedicated my life to you all, but never, not once, did I stop being Olga. A person with dignity." I paused, feeling my voice grow firmer. "I am not an old piece of furniture to be put in a corner when it no longer matches the decor. I am not an inconvenience. I am the woman who gave you life and raised you, Deborah. And I deserve, at the very least, respect." "Mom, you're exaggerating." Deborah tried to interrupt. "No, I'm not. You've left me out in the cold. You've excluded me from my grandchildren's lives. And that's fine. It's your choice. But it's also my choice not to accept crumbs of affection." I took an envelope from my purse. "Here's Matthew's gift. It's a savings account I opened for him. Every month I deposit a little from my retirement. There's enough to help with his college when he grows up." I placed the envelope on the coffee table. "Starting today, I will no longer beg to be a part of your lives. My door will always be open, but I will no longer knock on yours just to be humiliated." I saw tears well up in Deborah's eyes, but I wasn't moved. Years of small rejections had accumulated to this moment. "Grandma!" Matthew's voice came from the backyard. He ran and hugged me around the legs. "Did you bring mini cheesecakes?" I knelt down and hugged him tight, feeling his warm little body against mine. The scent of kids' shampoo in his hair. For a moment it was all worth it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny saved. For that hug, I'd do it all again. "Not today, sweetheart, but whenever you want mini cheesecakes, ask your mom to take you to Grandma's house, okay?" I kissed his forehead and stood up. I looked at Deborah one last time, waiting for... what? An apology? A promise of change? I wasn't sure. But what I saw was confusion. Maybe a hint of regret, but also that familiar stubbornness. That inability to give an inch. I left without looking back, feeling a mix of pain and relief. On the sidewalk, I took a deep breath of the morning air. 70 years, and I finally understood that I deserve more than leftover consideration. But what would happen next? How would my life be without regular visits with my grandchildren? How would Deborah react to my ultimatum? And Melissa, who always tried to stay on the fence, whose side would she be on now? As I walked toward the bus stop, I realized that, for the first time in decades, the future was completely uncertain. And strangely, it didn't scare me as much as it should have. Perhaps because, finally, that future depended on my choices, not just the goodwill of others. The cab drove away, taking me back home. Through the window, I saw Deborah's silhouette standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't wave, nor did I look back. 70 years taught me that some bridges, once burned, need to be rebuilt from scratch, if they ever are rebuilt. In the days that followed, my apartment felt larger and quieter than ever. I found myself looking at the phone several times, waiting for a call that didn't come. Part of me, that part that always gave in, that always put others first, wanted to call Deborah, to say I'd exaggerated, that we could forget everything. But another part, perhaps the wiser one, knew that some wounds need to bleed before they heal. On the Wednesday after the incident, I was watering my African violets when the phone rang. It was Melissa. "Mom, how are you?" "I'm fine, honey." I tried to keep my voice steady, though my heart sped up. "Deborah told me what happened. That you went there and finally said what needed to be said." I finished. There was a silence on the other end of the line. I could imagine Melissa biting her lower lip, as she always did when she was nervous. "Mom, I understand you were hurt, but it's not about being hurt, Melissa. It's about dignity. She's devastated, you know. After you left, she cried all day." I felt a pang in my chest. The image of Deborah crying hurt me more than I'd like to admit. After all, no matter the age, a mother never stops suffering for her children's pain. "And the grandkids? How are they?" "Matthew asks about you every day. He wants to know when he can come over for mini cheesecakes at Grandma's house." I closed my eyes, feeling the tears I'd held back for days finally escape. "Tell him my door's always open. Always." "Mom." Melissa's voice faltered. "You really aren't going to back down? You're not going to call Deborah?" "No, honey. This time the move has to come from her." After I hung up, I sat looking at my hands. Wrinkled hands, speckled with age spots and prominent veins. Hands that had cradled babies, sewn clothes, prepared thousands of meals, dried so many tears, my own and others. Hands that now seemed empty. 3 weeks passed without news from Deborah. Melissa called almost daily, bringing small updates about the grandchildren, about how Matthew had gotten an A in math, about how Sophia had learned to jump rope. Small fragments of the life I used to share, now reaching me like news from a distant country. One Sunday afternoon, I was organizing old photo albums when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors. I quickly adjusted my hair and went to answer it. It was James, my son-in-law, standing uncomfortably on the doorstep, holding an envelope. "Olga," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Can I come in for a minute?" I was surprised. In 10 years of marriage to my daughter, James rarely sought me out alone. He was a quiet man who always seemed intimidated by Deborah's strong personality, and more recently, by his own mother's dominating presence. "Of course, come in." He sat on the edge of the sofa, as if ready to bolt at any moment. I offered him coffee, which he refused with a nervous gesture. "I came to bring this," he said, extending the envelope. "It's a drawing Matthew made for you. He insisted I deliver it." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a colorful drawing made with markers. It showed a figure with white hair, presumably me, holding what looked like yellow mini cheesecakes. Beside it, a smaller figure, Matthew, with a big smile. At the top, in clumsy, colorful letters, it read, "To the coolest grandma in the world." My eyes welled up. "He misses you a lot, Mom," James said, finally looking at me. "Sophia does too. They don't understand why you stopped visiting." "I didn't stop visiting, James. I was prevented from coming." He looked away again, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, Mom, I know things got complicated. Deborah can be stubborn, and her mom." He hesitated. "Vera sometimes interferes too much." It was the first time I'd heard James admit it. I'd always seen him as a silent accomplice to Vera and Deborah's actions. "Why did you come, James? Did Deborah send you?" "No," he quickly replied. "She doesn't know I'm here. Actually." He took a deep breath. "I came because I can't stand seeing the kids ask about you anymore. And because... well, because I don't think you deserve to be treated that way." That admission, coming from the man who always seemed so passive, caught me off guard. "Thank you for bringing the drawing," I said, folding it carefully. "It means a lot to me." James stood up, looking relieved to have completed his mission. At the door, he hesitated. "Mom, are you really going to wait for Deborah to make the first move? Because, knowing my wife, that could take a very long time." I smiled sadly. "Some lessons have to be learned the hard way, James, even for a 70-year-old woman like me." After he left, I went back to my photo albums. I found an old picture of Deborah when she was about 7. We were at the park, and she'd just fallen off the swing. Her knee was scraped, but she refused to cry, chin jutted out, defiant to the world. Even as a child, she showed that stubbornness that would define her as an adult. I remembered how she went a week without speaking to me at 12, when I wouldn't let her go to a party at a friend's house I barely knew. Or how at 16, she spent an entire month treating me with one-word answers because I wouldn't let her travel with friends to the beach. Deborah was always like that, intense in her feelings, absolute in her convictions, unable to give in even when she knew she was wrong. So much like Augustus in that respect. So different from Melissa, who always sought reconciliation. One Saturday morning, almost a month after my visit to Deborah's house, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The same kind of fine drizzle that fell on Matthew's birthday. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the drops against the glass, feeling the weight of my 70 years. I got up slowly, made my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, except for the tick-tock of the wall clock. A gift Deborah had given me many years ago, when she moved into her first place. "So you won't lose track of time visiting us," she'd said then, with that smile that lit up her face. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I looked at the clock. 9:17 in the morning. Who could it be at that hour on a rainy Saturday? When I opened the door, my heart almost stopped. Deborah stood there, completely soaked, holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. Her eyes were raw, as if she'd cried herself dry or hadn't slept. Maybe both. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She came in, leaving a trail of water on the floor. "You're drenched," I commented, grabbing a towel from the linen closet. Did you walk in the rain?" She nodded, accepting the towel. "The car's in the shop. I took a bus, but from the stop to here." "You could have called. I would have come to get you." A heavy silence settled between us. There was so much to say, so many wounds to heal, that neither of us knew where to begin. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the plate she was holding. Deborah removed the aluminum foil, revealing perfectly golden mini cheesecakes. "I tried to make your recipe," she offered with a sad smile. "They're not as good as yours, but—" "You never had the patience for cooking," I commented, remembering how she always preferred more active pursuits as a child. "No," she agreed. "I was always awful at it." Another silence. I offered coffee, which she accepted. We sat at the kitchen table, the plate of mini cheesecakes between us like a peace offering. "Mom," she finally began, her voice trembling slightly. I don't even know where to start." "The beginning is usually a good place," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I was horrible to you, that day, in the rain, and before that too. I let other people influence how I treated my own mother." "Vera," I said, not as a question, but a statement. Deborah nodded. She always had strong opinions about how I should raise my kids, about how you were, old-fashioned, about how your sweets were bad for the children, about how your stories about Augustus confused them. And you believed her. "Not at first," Deborah said, nervously stirring her coffee. "At first I defended you, but she was so persistent, always with those comments, those insinuations, and James never confronted her, so it was easier to push me away than to confront your mother-in-law." She lowered her eyes, ashamed. "Yes, and I hate myself for it." I remained silent, letting her continue. "After you left that day, after what you said, I couldn't stop thinking about everything you did for us, about how you raised Melissa and me alone, without ever complaining, about how you were always there, even when I was unbearable." She looked up, her eyes now filled with tears. "And then I realized I was doing exactly what Augustus did. I was abandoning you. I was choosing the easy way out." That comparison between her and Augustus caught me off guard. Deborah rarely spoke of her father, as if mentioning his name might conjure the pain of abandonment again. "You're not like your father," I said firmly. "Augustus chose to leave. You're here now. After leaving you in the rain, after cutting you out of your grandchildren's lives, after treating you like an inconvenience. Yes, after all that. But you're here." She covered her face with her hands and her shoulders began to tremble with suppressed sobs. Instinctively, I reached out and touched her arm, just like I used to when she was little and had nightmares. "Matthew asks about you every day," she said between sobs. "He saves the drawings he makes to show you when you come back. Sophia. She took a picture of you and put it by her bed." My heart ached thinking of my grandchildren, missing me without understanding why their grandma had disappeared from their lives. "And what does Vera say about that?" I asked, unable to hold back the question. Deborah wiped her tears and looked directly at me for the first time since she arrived. "I told her I don't want her advice anymore about how to handle my family. I told her if she can't respect my mother, then maybe she should limit her visits." I was genuinely surprised. Knowing Deborah and her reluctance to confront, That must have taken a lot of courage. And how did she react? Just as you'd imagine. She was furious, said I was being ungrateful after everything she'd done for the kids. James finally took my side, which made her even angrier. James supported you? I couldn't hide my surprise. Deborah nodded. He came here, didn't he? To bring Matthew's drawing. Yes, he did. It was his idea. He said I was being too proud, that I needed to admit my mistakes, that you deserved more than a phone apology. I looked at my daughter, this adult woman who somehow still seemed like that stubborn little girl who refused to cry when she fell, who hid her vulnerability behind a facade of strength, who, like all of us, was just trying to find her way. You know what hurt me most that day? I asked softly. It wasn't standing in the rain, or not being able to give Matthew his gift. It was realizing that, somehow, I'd become dispensable in your lives. That everything I'd done, all the sacrifices, could be so easily forgotten. You'll never be dispensable, Mom, Deborah said, holding my hand. Never. I was selfish and cowardly. I let the fear of confronting Vera be greater than the respect I owe you. We sat in silence for a moment, our hands joined on the table. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but somehow, it felt less sad now. The mini cheesecakes, I finally said, pointing to the plate. Can I try one? Deborah smiled through her tears. They're awful. I think I put too much sugar in them. I picked one up and took a bite. They really were too sweet, almost cloying, and the texture was far from perfect. They're not that bad, I lied, making her laugh. They're terrible and you know it. I never had your patience in the kitchen. Neither did your sister. Remember when Melissa tried to bake a cake for your dad's birthday? It was so hard we could have used it as a brick. Deborah laughed, remembering. Dad pretended it was delicious. He ate 2 pieces just so he wouldn't hurt her feelings. Your father had his faults, but he loved you in his own way. She nodded, thoughtful. You know, after you left that day, I kept thinking a lot about Augustus. About how he left us. About how I always swore I'd never make anyone feel abandoned the way he made us feel. And then you realized you were doing exactly that to me. Yes, she admitted, lowering her eyes. And with my kids, too. In a way, I was depriving them of the grandma they adore. All to please someone who isn't even really family. That admission that Vera wasn't real family caught me off guard. It was the first time Deborah had drawn such a clear line. What do you want now, Deborah? I asked directly. Why did you come here today? She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. I came to apologize, and to ask you to come back into our lives. The kids miss you so much, and I do too. I looked at my daughter, this woman I carried in my womb, nursed, taught to walk and talk, watched grow up and become a mother herself. This woman who, despite all her mistakes, was standing there, vulnerable, asking for a second chance. You know what I've learned in 70 years, Deborah? Forgiveness isn't something you give just once. It's a choice you make every day, in little ways. She nodded, understanding. I'm willing to make that choice, I continued. But I need you to understand that I can't accept being treated as disposable anymore. I have dignity, and I deserve respect. I know, Mom, and I promise things will be different. I don't want grand promises. I just want you to remember who we are to each other. Everything we've been through together. Deborah got up and walked around the table, kneeling beside me and hugging me tight. I felt her tears soak my shoulder and let my own finally fall. "Can I bring the kids to see you tomorrow?" she asked, still holding me. "They're dying to tell you about school, about their new friends." "Of course you can. I'll make mini cheesecakes for them." She laughed, pulling back to look at me. "And you can tell all the stories you want about Augustus. I think it's time they learned that part of our history, too." That concession, letting me talk about Augustus with the grandkids, meant more than Deborah could possibly imagine. It was an acknowledgement that our story, with all its imperfections, deserved to be told. The following Sunday, my apartment was filled with voices and laughter. Matthew and Sophia ran from one end of the room to the other, exploring every nook and cranny like it was their first time there. Deborah and James were sitting on the couch, more relaxed than I'd seen them in a long time. "Grandma, look what I learned to do," Sophia exclaimed, trying to do a somersault on the living room rug and nearly knocking over a vase. "Careful, sweetie," I said, laughing at her energy. "That vase belonged to your great-grandma." "Grandma's mom?" she asked, eyes wide at the idea that I once had a mother too. "Yes, my mother. Her name was Antonia." "What was great-grandma like, Grandma?" Matthew asked, joining the conversation. I looked at Deborah, who nodded encouragingly. It was the first time in years I felt truly free to share our family stories without fear of being out of touch or confusing the kids. "Well, your great-grandma Antonia was an incredible woman. She came from Italy when she was just a little girl, with her parents. Didn't speak a word of English when she arrived. I spent the afternoon telling stories about my mother, about my father, about how I met Augustus, about what Deborah was like as a baby." The children listened, fascinated, asking questions, wanting to know more about their roots. At one point, I caught Deborah looking at me with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked softly, while the kids were distracted with the photo albums I'd pulled out. "Nothing," she said, wiping away a tear. "It's just that I'd forgotten how well you tell these stories, how you make our family seem special, even with all the problems we've had." "Our family is special," I replied. "Not because we're perfect, but because we keep trying, even when we mess up." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on us, Mom. For having the courage to say what needed to be said, even when it hurt." In that moment, looking at my daughter, at my grandchildren, at this small apartment filled with life again, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. I knew we'd still have challenges ahead, that Vera would probably continue to be a complicated presence, that Deborah and I would still have our moments of disagreement. But there was something different now, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before, a recognition that despite all our flaws, we were family, and that in itself was something too precious to waste. As they were leaving, Matthew hugged me tight. "Grandma, can I sleep here next week? I want to hear more stories about great-grandma Antonia." "Of course you can, my love. I'll get your room ready." Deborah smiled, nodding in approval. "We can bring him over on Friday if that works for you." "Perfect," I replied, feeling my heart warm at the prospect. After they left, I stood at the window, observing them get into the car. Deborah looked up and waved, with a smile that reminded me so much of the little girl she used to be. I waved back, feeling a deep gratitude for this second chance. I went back into the living room and started tidying up the small mess the kids had left. I found a drawing Sophia had made, a stick-figure family, with a white-haired figure in the center, surrounded by smaller figures. At the top, in colorful, wobbly letters, it read, "My family." I put the drawing on the fridge, held by a magnet. 70 years of life taught me that families are complicated, imperfect, sometimes painful. But they also taught me that, when built on respect and true love, they are the most precious thing we can have. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if Deborah will keep her promise, if Vera will accept her new, more limited role, if we'll manage to maintain this newfound peace. But I know that, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel invisible. I am seen, heard, valued. I'm Olga, a mother, a grandmother, a 70-year-old woman with stories to tell and love to give. And that in itself is a victory no one can take from me.